April 1945, Bergen-Belsen, northern Germany. The rain fell in soft sheets across the wire fence, turning the earth to black mud beneath the boots of the British soldier. Private James Thornton stood at the gate of what had once been a concentration camp and was now a makeshift prisoner of war holding area, watching the figures inside move like shadows through the mist. The smell reached him first, before his eyes could fully register what lay beyond the barbed wire. It was the smell of death and disease, of bodies left too long in the spring warmth, of human waste and unwashed flesh. He had been warned. Nothing could have prepared him. Among the prisoners were German civilians, soldiers, and camp personnel, all mixed together in the chaos of liberation and collapse. The British had taken thousands into custody as they swept through northern Germany in those final weeks of the war. Some were guilty of terrible crimes, others had simply been caught in the machinery of a dying regime. But in that moment, standing in the rain, Thornton could see only hunger. He saw her then, a woman perhaps 30 years old, though hunger had made her ageless. She wore the remnants of what might have been a Wehrmacht auxiliary uniform, the grey fabric hanging loose on a frame that had forgotten what fullness meant. Her hair, once blonde, hung in matted strands around a face carved hollow by starvation. Her eyes, pale as winter sky, fixed on the tin of rations in his hand. She did not beg. She did not speak. She simply stared with the intensity of someone watching their last hope drift away on the current of a river. Thornton had been raised in Yorkshire in a stone cottage that always smelled of bread baking and lamb stewing. His mother had taught him that hunger was a sin against God's creation, that no living thing should be left to starve while others ate their fill. He had joined the army in 1942 with those principles carved into his bones, and 3 years of war had not yet beaten them out of him. He looked at the woman. He looked at the tin in his hand. Then he stepped forward. The war in Europe was collapsing like a house of cards in those spring weeks of 1945. The Red Army pressed from the east, crushing German resistance with the weight of millions of men and thousands of tanks. The Americans and British drove from the west, their air forces turning German cities into fields of rubble. Between these closing jaws, the German people found themselves trapped in a nightmare of their own making. By April 1945, food supplies across Germany had reached catastrophic levels. The Allied bombing campaign had destroyed railways and roads, making transport of goods nearly impossible. Farmers had been conscripted into the army or killed in battle. Fields lay untended. What food remained was hoarded by the Wehrmacht for its crumbling forces or seized by local officials for their own survival. The German ration, which had once provided 2,000 calories per day, had collapsed to less than 1,000 in many cities. People ate potato peels, sawdust mixed with flour, boiled grass. The old and the young died first. The prisoners of war faced even grimmer circumstances. The Geneva Convention theoretically protected military prisoners, but in the chaos of Germany's defeat, these protections dissolved like salt in water. The German POWs held by the Western Allies numbered in the hundreds of thousands by late April, soon to become millions. The British and Americans, unprepared for such numbers, struggled to feed, shelter, and process them all. Camps were hastily erected in open fields, surrounded by wire, with little more than the sky for shelter. Bergen-Belsen had been liberated on April 15, 1945. What the British found there defied description. Tens of thousands of corpses lay unburied. The living crawled among the dead, their bodies reduced to skeletons wrapped in skin, their minds often broken beyond repair. The British soldiers who entered that place wept openly. Some vomited, others simply stood in stunned silence, unable to process the depths of human cruelty laid bare before them. In the weeks that followed, the British converted the camp into a holding area for German prisoners, while they figured out what to do with the enormous population of displaced persons, war criminals, and enemy combatants. German soldiers, SS officers, civilian administrators, and even women's auxiliary corps members found themselves penned behind the same wire that had once held those they had helped to imprison. The irony was not lost on anyone. The rations provided to German POWs in British custody were calculated based on Geneva Convention minimums, but in practice, distribution was chaotic. Supply lines stretched thin, military priorities came first. The German prisoners received what was left over, which was often not enough to sustain life over any meaningful length of time. Reports from the International Red Cross documented severe malnutrition in the camps throughout the summer of 1945. Photographs from that period show prisoners who looked almost identical to concentration camp survivors, hollow-eyed, skeletal, barely able to stand. Private Thornton approached the woman slowly, as one might approach a wounded animal. She did not move. Her eyes followed the tin of rations in his hand with absolute focus. Around them, other prisoners began to notice, pressing closer to the wire, their faces masks of desperate hope. He knelt in the mud and pushed the tin through a gap in the fence. His commanding officer had forbidden fraternization with prisoners. Orders were clear. Maintain distance, maintain discipline, maintain the boundary between victor and vanquished. But Thornton had seen enough death. He had pulled bodies from burning tanks, held dying men as they called for their mothers, walked through villages where every building had been reduced to rubble. He no longer had room in his heart for the abstract necessities of military discipline when faced with the concrete reality of starvation. The woman's hands shot out and grabbed the tin with surprising strength. She did not open it immediately. Instead, she pulled it close to her chest, cradling it like a child, and for the first time she looked directly at Thornton. Her eyes were wet, but no tears fell. Perhaps she had no moisture left to spare for crying. She whispered something in German. Thornton did not speak the language, but he understood gratitude when he heard it. He nodded and stood to leave, but as he turned, he heard her voice again, stronger this time. She was still speaking German, rapid words tumbling over each other, but then she switched to broken English, her voice raw with urgency. "You are mine now," she said. "You are mine now. You saved me. You are mine." Thornton stopped. He turned back to her, confused. She pressed herself against the wire, her fingers threading through the metal diamonds, her face illuminated by something beyond hunger, beyond desperation. It was recognition. The recognition that survival had come from an act of individual kindness in a world that had abandoned all pretense of such things. In saving her, he had bound himself to her in ways neither of them fully understood yet. He did not know what to say, so he simply nodded once more and walked away, back toward the guard post, back toward the routine of military occupation. But something had changed. He had crossed a line drawn by war and found a human being on the other side, and she had claimed him as her own, not in possession, but in the ancient covenant that exists between one who gives life and one who receives it. The days that followed were a study in transformation. Thornton returned to the wire each evening after his duties were complete, always carrying something: a tin of meat, a piece of bread wrapped in cloth. Once, a small bag of dried fruit that had been part of an officer's personal stores. He never spoke much, she never asked for anything, but each exchange was an act of rebellion against the machinery of war that sought to reduce human beings to categories: enemy, prisoner, victor, vanquished. He learned her name was Greta. She had been a secretary in the Wehrmacht Auxiliary, assigned to a logistics office in Hamburg. When the city was destroyed by firebombing in 1943, she had been transferred north, further from the front, further from danger, or so she had thought. By April 1945, nowhere in Germany was safe. Her office had been overrun by British forces. She had been taken prisoner along with hundreds of others, sorted and categorized, then shipped to Bergen-Belsen to await processing. She had not been part of the camp's operation. She had not participated in any crimes, but in the eyes of the occupation authority, she was German, and therefore guilty by association until proven otherwise. She told him these things in fragments, her English improving with each conversation. He told her about Yorkshire, about the green hills and stone walls, about his mother's cooking and his father's sheep farm. They were absurd conversations to have through barbed wire, between a soldier and a prisoner, between nations that had spent 6 years trying to destroy each other. But in the ruins of April 1945, absurdity had become the only form of sanity available. The other guards noticed. Some approved quietly, slipping Thornton extra rations to pass through the wire. Others reported him to their sergeant, who hauled him in for a dressing down about fraternization policies and maintaining proper distance from enemy personnel. Thornton listened, nodded, and continued his evening visits anyway. The sergeant, a veteran of the First World War who had seen his own share of horror, eventually looked the other way. The transformation was not just in Greta's body, though that was the most visible change. Over the weeks that followed, she began to gain weight, slowly, carefully. The hollows in her cheeks filled in slightly. Her eyes regained some spark of animation, but the deeper transformation was internal. She began to remember that she was human, that life was more than the animal struggle for the next meal, that the future was something she might actually see. For Thornton, the transformation was equally profound. He had come to Germany as a conqueror, wearing the moral certainty of the victor. He had been told that Germans were the enemy, that they had brought this destruction upon themselves, that any suffering they endured was justified by the monstrous crimes their nation had committed. And those crimes were real. He had seen the evidence at Bergen-Belsen with his own eyes. The mass graves, the gas chambers, the meticulous records of murder. But in feeding Greta, in seeing her humanity emerge from behind the mask of hunger, he had discovered something that military training had tried to beat out of him. The enemy was also human. This did not excuse the crimes, it did not erase the guilt, but it complicated the simple narrative of good versus evil that war requires to function. It reminded him that beneath the uniforms and flags and ideologies, people were still just people, capable of both tremendous cruelty and tremendous kindness, often in the same breath. The historical record of those months after Germany's surrender in May 1945 is filled with stories like Thornton's, though most went unrecorded. Individual acts of mercy and kindness flickered across the landscape of occupation like fireflies in the darkness. A French soldier sharing his cigarettes with a German prisoner. An American nurse tending to wounded SS men with the same care she gave her own troops. A Soviet officer stopping his men from executing a group of Hitler youth who had surrendered. These acts stood in stark contrast to the official policies and the prevailing attitudes. The Allies had decided that Germany must be punished, that the German people must be made to feel the weight of their crimes. General Eisenhower initially classified German POWs as disarmed enemy forces rather than prisoners of war, a bureaucratic sleight of hand that exempted the Americans from Geneva Convention requirements regarding housing, food, and medical care. Hundreds of thousands of German prisoners were held in open-air camps along the Rhine through the summer of 1945, exposed to the elements, surviving on minimal rations. Estimates of deaths in these camps range from thousands to tens of thousands, depending on the source. The British treated their prisoners somewhat better, but the challenges were immense. Britain itself was exhausted by 6 years of war, its cities bombed, its economy in ruins, its people rationed and weary. Finding food for millions of German prisoners while British civilians went hungry was a political impossibility. So the prisoners starved, slowly, legally, while the world looked away. The transformation in public opinion took longer to arrive than the physical transformation of individuals like Greta. Throughout 1945 and into 1946, the Nuremberg trials revealed the full scope of Nazi crimes in meticulous detail. The world learned about the industrial machinery of the Holocaust, the deliberate starvation of Soviet POWs, the medical experiments, the mobile killing squads. The moral equation seemed clear. Germany had sown the wind and was now reaping the whirlwind. But gradually, other voices began to emerge. Relief workers from the Red Cross and other humanitarian organizations reported on conditions in the POW camps. Journalists documented the starvation. Photographers captured images of German prisoners who looked disturbingly similar to concentration camp survivors. Questions began to be asked. Were the Allies becoming what they had fought against? Was vengeance the same as justice? Could human rights be conditional, applied only to those who had not forfeited them through crimes? These were not easy questions. They had no clear answers, but they forced a reckoning with the fundamental principles at stake. If human dignity was truly universal, if the rights enumerated in the Atlantic Charter and later in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights were to mean anything, they had to apply even to enemies, even to those who had committed terrible crimes. Otherwise, they were merely propaganda, weapons of war rather than genuine principles. By the summer of 1945, the wire at Bergen-Belsen came down. The camp was evacuated, its prisoners processed and sorted, sent to other facilities or released back into a Germany that had become a landscape of ruins. Greta was among those released. She had no home to return to. Hamburg was rubble. She had no family. They had been killed in the bombing raids. She had no possessions beyond the clothes on her back and the small bundle of items Thornton had managed to give her over the months. Thornton received orders to ship out to Berlin as part of the occupation force. He had assumed that would be the end of it, that Greta would vanish back into the vast sea of displaced persons flooding across post-war Europe. But she did not vanish. She found him before he left, somehow navigating the bureaucratic maze of the occupation, somehow locating his unit among the thousands of British soldiers stationed in northern Germany. She found him in a moment that felt borrowed from another life, standing outside a requisitioned German farmhouse that served as his unit's temporary headquarters. The sun was setting, turning the sky the colour of blood and gold. She walked up the dirt road toward him, no longer skeletal, no longer hollow-eyed, but still bearing the marks of what she had endured. She stopped a few feet away and simply looked at him. "You are mine," she said again, just as she had said months before through the wire. But now the words carried a different weight. They were not the desperate claim of a starving prisoner on a saviour. They were a statement of fact, a recognition of a bond forged in the fire of the worst that humanity could do and the best that humanity could be. Thornton did not know what to say. The rules of occupation forbade relationships between British soldiers and German civilians. Fraternization was grounds for court-martial. But the rules had already been broken the moment he pushed that first tin of rations through the wire. What he did next was not recorded in any official document. There are no photographs, no letters home, no military reports. But the logic of human connection suggests the only possible outcome. He helped her find shelter. He arranged papers through connections that operated outside official channels. He visited when he could, bringing food, bringing news, bringing the quiet companionship of someone who understood what she had survived because he had witnessed it. And when his enlistment ended in 1946, when he was finally free to return to Yorkshire and civilian life, he did not leave her behind. The details are lost to history, but the shape of it is clear enough. Somehow, through some combination of official channels and unofficial favours, through persistence and paperwork and the slow grinding of bureaucratic machinery, she came with him. The years that followed were not easy. Britain, in the late 1940s, was a nation struggling to rebuild, to feed its people, to make sense of a world that had been torn apart and inadequately stitched back together. Anti-German sentiment remained strong. German women who married British soldiers faced suspicion and often outright hostility. They were called names in the street, refused service in shops, treated as the enemy even as the official war had ended. Greta endured this with the same quiet strength that had allowed her to survive starvation. She learned to speak English fluently, to cook Yorkshire pudding and roast beef, to navigate the subtle hierarchies of British village life. She worked in the local shops, in the factories that were beginning to rebuild British industry, in the quiet, unglamorous jobs that kept communities functioning. Thornton returned to his father's farm, taking over the flock of sheep that had grazed those hills for generations. Life settled into a rhythm that bore no resemblance to the chaos of war. Seasons turned, lambs were born, wool was sheared and sold. The stone cottage filled with the smell of bread baking once more. They did not speak much about what had happened during the war. That was common among veterans and survivors. The past was a country too painful to visit regularly. But occasionally, on quiet evenings when the Yorkshire wind howled across the moors, when the darkness pressed close against the windows, Greta would tell fragments of her story. Not the whole thing, never the whole thing, but pieces that she could bear to examine in the light. She spoke about the hunger, about the way it had consumed everything else, about how the entire world had narrowed to the single obsession of food. She spoke about the moment when Thornton had pushed that first tin through the wire, about how it had felt like a miracle, like proof that kindness had not been entirely extinguished from the world. She spoke about the decision she had made in that moment, the recognition that this man who had chosen to feed her when he could have walked away was someone worth following to the ends of the earth. Thornton listened. He did not fully understand. Not really. He had never been hungry like that. He had never faced the choice between his own survival and someone else's, never stood on the edge of the abyss and looked into the void. But he understood enough. He understood that what he had done, something so simple as sharing food, had meant the difference between life and death, between hope and despair. Between the world remaining recognizable and the world descending into pure animal chaos. The transformation of Germany itself mirrored in some ways the transformation of individuals like Greta, the nation that had launched the most destructive war in human history, that had committed genocide on an industrial scale, had to somehow find a way back to civilization. The path was neither straight nor certain. In the immediate post-war years, Germany was a wasteland. Cities lay in ruins. Millions were dead. Millions more were displaced, refugees wandering across a continent that had been carved up by the victorious powers. Food remained scarce well into the late 1940s. The winter of 1946 to 1947, known as the Hunger Winter, killed tens of thousands more Germans who had survived the war only to succumb to cold and starvation in its aftermath. But gradually, painfully, Germany began to rebuild. The Marshall Plan, announced in 1947, poured American money and resources into European reconstruction, including into Germany. The currency reform of 1948 stabilized the economy. The Berlin airlift of 1948 to 1949 demonstrated that the Western Allies were committed to protecting German democracy from Soviet expansion. By the early 1950s, the German economic miracle was underway, transforming West Germany into one of the most prosperous nations in Europe. This transformation required more than just economic reform. It required a moral reckoning. The German people had to confront what had been done in their name, had to acknowledge the crimes, had to find a way to live with the guilt. This process was imperfect, often incomplete. Many Nazis escaped justice. Many crimes went unpunished. Many Germans preferred to forget rather than remember. But there were also Germans who chose differently, who faced the past honestly, who worked to build a new Germany based on democratic principles, human rights, and the rule of law, who recognized that nationalism and militarism had led their nation to destruction and sought a different path. The Germany that emerged from this process was fundamentally different from the Germany that had started the war, not perfect, never perfect, but genuinely transformed. The transformation was made possible, in part, by individual acts of mercy, like Thornton's. Every time an Allied soldier chose to see a German as a human being, rather than just an enemy, every time food was shared instead of withheld, every time kindness replaced vengeance, a small space opened up for a different future. These acts did not erase the crimes, they did not bring back the dead, but they created the possibility that something other than endless cycles of revenge might be possible. Greta lived in Yorkshire until her death in 1987. She and Thornton raised 3 children in that stone cottage, 3 children who grew up speaking English without a trace of German accent, who knew their mother's history only in fragments, who carried within them the legacy of survival and transformation without fully understanding its weight. She never returned to Germany. She never expressed any desire to do so. Whatever homeland she had known was gone, destroyed not just by bombs, but by the revelation of what had been done there, by the knowledge that the nation she had served, however peripherally, had committed crimes beyond comprehension. She had chosen, instead, to make a new home in a new land, to build a new identity brick by brick, to live quietly and without fanfare in a place that had accepted her only grudgingly. But she never forgot what had saved her. Until the end of her life, she kept a small tin box in her dresser drawer, the same tin that Thornton had pushed through the wire in April 1945. It was empty, dented, rusted in places. But she kept it polished, kept it protected, kept it as a reminder of the moment when one person's choice to share what little he had made the difference between life and death. When she died, the box passed to her eldest daughter, who kept it without fully understanding its significance. It sits now in an attic somewhere in Yorkshire, a piece of history that means nothing to anyone except those who know its story. But its existence is a testament to something profound, that in the darkest moments of human history, individual choices still matter, individual acts of kindness still have weight, individual connections still have the power to transform. The story of Private James Thornton and Greta is fiction, but the history it draws from is real. Thousands of British soldiers served as guards in German POW camps in 1945. Thousands of German women were held as prisoners in those camps. The conditions were as described: chaotic, dangerous, marked by hunger and disease. And undoubtedly, somewhere in that landscape of suffering, individual acts of mercy occurred. Soldiers who chose kindness over cruelty, prisoners who survived because someone shared their rations. These stories are largely lost to history. They were not recorded in official documents. They did not fit the narrative of either victor or vanquished. They were private moments, personal choices, enacted in the shadows of greater events. But they mattered. They mattered to the individuals involved, whose lives were shaped by those moments. And they matter to us now, as we try to understand what it means to be human in the face of inhumanity, what it means to choose mercy in a world that often seems designed to reward cruelty. The transformation that such moments enable is not complete, it is not universal. Individual kindness cannot undo systemic evil, cannot bring back the murdered millions, cannot rebuild destroyed cities. But it can do something. It can remind us that we are more than our ideologies, more than our national identities, more than our uniforms and our enemies and our hatreds. It can remind us that beneath all of these categories, we are simply human beings, sharing the same fundamental needs: for food, for shelter, for connection, for the recognition that our lives have value. The world that emerged from the Second World War was shaped by many forces. The Cold War divisions, the process of decolonization, the establishment of the United Nations and the Declaration of Human Rights, the economic reconstruction and the political realignments. But it was also shaped, in ways harder to measure but no less real, by the individual choices made in moments of crisis, by soldiers who chose to feed prisoners instead of letting them starve, by nurses who tended to enemy wounded, by civilians who sheltered the persecuted, by ordinary people who, when faced with the choice between cruelty and kindness, chose kindness. These choices did not guarantee a better world. The decades since 1945 have been marked by continued violence, continued injustice, continued suffering. The lessons of the war were learned imperfectly, sometimes not at all. Genocide continued, wars continued. The strong continued to oppress the weak, nations continued to pursue their interests at the expense of others, ideologies continued to demand sacrifice of human dignity in pursuit of abstract goals. But the possibility of something different remained. The recognition that another way was possible, that human beings could choose differently, that the bonds of common humanity could sometimes prove stronger than the divisions of nation and ideology and war. This recognition was fragile, easily forgotten, often ignored. But it persisted, kept alive by stories like Thornton's and Greta's, real and imagined, stories that reminded people that in the darkest moments, light could still break through. There is a photograph that does not exist, but should. Private Thornton standing at the wire in April 1945, his hand extended through the fence, a tin of rations passing from his fingers to Greta's. The rain falling around them, turning the world to grey. The camp stretched out behind her, filled with thousands of other prisoners, other stories, other moments of connection and cruelty. His face would show fatigue, confusion, the moral exhaustion of a young man trying to do right in a world that had lost all sense of right and wrong. Her face would show hunger, hope, and something else, recognition that she had been seen, that her humanity had been acknowledged by someone who had every reason to turn away. This photograph does not exist because no one thought to take it. Individual acts of mercy are rarely documented. They happen in the margins, in the moments between official events, in the spaces that historians often overlook. But the absence of documentation does not mean absence of occurrence. All across Germany in 1945, similar moments played out, unrecorded and largely forgotten. What we are left with is the knowledge that such moments were possible, that even in the aftermath of the worst war in human history, even in the presence of crimes that defied comprehension, individual human beings could still choose to see each other as human. This knowledge is not much. It does not undo the past. It does not guarantee a better future. But it is something. It is a foundation, however small, on which to build. The larger truth that emerges from stories like this is uncomfortable. That liberation is not always glorious. That victory is not always righteous. That the categories of good and evil that war requires are never as clear as we need them to be. The Allied soldiers who liberated Bergen-Belsen were heroes, genuinely so. They ended the Nazi regime, freed the concentration camps, stopped the genocide, but they were also fallible human beings, operating within systems that sometimes demanded cruelty in the name of justice, that punished collectively rather than individually, that struggled to maintain moral clarity in the face of moral complexity. Thornton's choice to feed Greta was not a repudiation of the Allied cause. It was not a statement that all sides were equally guilty, or that German suffering was equivalent to the suffering inflicted by Germany. It was simply a recognition that hunger is hunger, that a starving human being deserves food regardless of what nation they served, regardless of what crimes their government committed. This recognition did not require forgetting the crimes. It did not require moral equivalence. It simply required seeing a human being and responding with humanity. This is the transformation that matters most. Not the transformation of nations or ideologies or political systems, but the transformation of individual perception, the moment when we recognize that the person in front of us, regardless of what category they belong to, is fundamentally like us, equally deserving of dignity and care. This transformation is rare. It is difficult. It goes against every instinct that war cultivates, every lesson that conflict teaches. But it is possible. And when it occurs, it creates ripples that extend far beyond the initial moment. The epilogue of this story is written not in the past, but in the present, in every choice we make about how to treat those we consider other, those we consider enemy, those we consider undeserving. The questions that Thornton faced in April 1945 are questions we still face. Do human rights apply universally, or only to those who have earned them? Is mercy weakness or strength? Can we recognize the humanity of those who have committed or enabled terrible crimes without excusing those crimes? These questions have no easy answers. But the story of Thornton and Greta suggests a principle: that abundance of spirit, abundance of compassion, abundance of recognition of common humanity is not a finite resource to be carefully rationed. It does not run out when we extend it to those who seem least deserving. Instead, it multiplies. Each act of mercy makes the next act slightly easier, creates space for others to make similar choices, builds a foundation for a world where such choices become normal rather than exceptional. This is not a naive belief that kindness will solve all problems, or that individual actions can substitute for systemic change. The structures of injustice are real and require collective action to dismantle, but neither can systemic change occur without the individual transformations that make it possible. Without the recognition that the categories we use to organize the world, the divisions we create between us and them, are ultimately less real than the shared humanity that underlies them all. In the end, the story of a British soldier feeding a starving German prisoner is not a story about the war. It is a story about what comes after war, about how we choose to live in the world that conflict creates. It is a story about the freedom that comes not from victory, but from the choice to see clearly, to act justly, to recognize that our own humanity is diminished when we deny the humanity of others. It is a story about the abundance that exists even in scarcity, the surplus of spirit that allows us to share what little we have with those who have even less. And it is a story about the simple, radical proposition that every human being deserves to eat, deserves to live, deserves to be seen as more than an enemy or a category or a problem to be solved. This proposition is not complicated. It requires no advanced philosophy or moral reasoning. But it is revolutionary nonetheless, because it demands that we treat the world as it should be, rather than as it is, that we act as if human dignity were real, even when all evidence suggests otherwise. Private Thornton understood this instinctively that day in April 1945. He did not need anyone to explain it to him. He simply saw a woman starving behind wire and chose to share his food. In that moment, he enacted the most fundamental form of freedom, the freedom to choose compassion over indifference, connection over division, life over death. And in that choice, he transformed not just Greta's life, but his own, creating a bond that would endure long after the war's end, a bond that testified to the possibility that even in humanity's darkest hour, light could still break through. This is what we are left with, not certainty, not easy answers, not the comfort of knowing that good always triumphs over evil, but possibility. The possibility that we might choose differently, that the next time we face someone we consider other, or enemy, or undeserving, we might see them clearly enough to recognize ourselves. The possibility that abundance of spirit might prove stronger than scarcity of resources. The possibility that the story is not yet finished, that the choices we make today might create the foundation for a different kind of tomorrow. In a world still marked by war and hunger and division, this possibility is both fragile and precious. It is kept alive by stories like this one, real and imagined, stories that remind us what we are capable of when we choose to be fully human. Stories that testify to the simple truth that when one person feeds another, when mercy flows across the divide that war has created, something transforms that cannot be undone. A woman lives who might have died. A soldier remembers his humanity. And somewhere, in the space between what was and what might be, a future takes shape that is different from the past. "You are mine now," she said. And in saying it, she spoke a truth larger than either of them understood. That in the act of saving, we ourselves are saved. That in extending life to another, we discover what it means to be alive. That the bonds created by mercy are stronger than the divisions created by war. This is the inheritance of that moment by the wire in April 1945. This is the freedom it offers us still.